Good morning, everybody. And yeah, I'm here to talk about open source, which is a thing that's very dear to me. Just a quick intro to myself. I think most people here probably know me already. I'm a freelancer. I've been doing stuff with open source operating systems, including just plain embedded Linux and also Android. And I organize the AOSP and AAOS meetup, which we'll come to later on. And you can contact me in various ways. So this talk then, I want to look at the role of open source really within the platform, although much of what I'm saying also applies equally to the application level, but mostly talking about the platform and mostly talking about Android Automotive. And why am I doing this? So the main things I want to do is to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that open source is important, especially at the platform level. And I want to go through and look at the platform and see which bits are open, which bits are not. I'll take a little bit of a diversion and talk about the Google Automotive Services or no Google Automotive Services debate and the effect of that and some mitigations we're talking about. And then I want to talk a little bit about AOSP devs and creating communities. OK, so why does open source matter? So Android is open source, and everything that goes on at this conference is ultimately based on open source. But it's not a big topic in most of the conversations. So why is it important? The key thing then, well, four main points here. First of all, it means that we can study the code. So this is really handy when you are working on an API and you want to know exactly what it does. You can dive into the code and see what it does and the behaviors that it's implementing and so on. So studying the code is probably the most important thing here. It also means that we can modify the code. So that's handy if you want to make some kind of enhancements or bug fixes or customizations to your platform. You can do that. Next one, access. It guarantees you get access to the code and to the logic behind it going into the future. Open source licenses guarantee basically no lock-in. So it gives you the flexibility, it gives you the guarantee that you'll always be able to access that code. Now, of course, upstream can modify the license, and they do that from time to time. But we have a way around that. We always have the option to fork the project. So if the upstream project changes the license or the project just becomes unmaintained for some reason, we can always fork it and create our own local, well, we can create a new project which carries that on in the way that we want. And the good example here recently would be the Redis. The Redis changed the license in ways that a lot of people didn't like, so they forked it. And there's a new project now called Valkey, which preserves the open source philosophy of the original project. So open source is important for these things, for these reasons. And open source is not just the code, it's also the community that goes around it. So how does that apply to Android? So, like I say, Android is open source. The core of Android is the AOSP, the Android Open Source Project. And since we're talking about automotive here as well, the Android Automotive OS is really just a variant of AOSP. So the majority of AOSP is licensed using so-called permissive licenses, Apache 2.0 being the main one. So these licenses give you pretty clear access to do whatever you like with the code. So you can download the code, you can look at it, modify it, you can use it to build products, and you can ship those products. And you don't even have to talk to Google to do that. So a lot of people do that. Amazon, for example, they ship their Fire TV sticks and the tablets. They are AOSP, not licensed from Google, but modified to fit in with their business model. So that's nice. There is also, as part of AOSP, there is a thing called the CTS, the Compatibility Test Suite. So if you run the CTS and you pass all the tests, and there are lots of them, this guarantees that your platform is going to be compatible and can run just generic APKs. There's also an interesting little clause in the there's some additional marketing stuff associated with AOSP. Essentially, you can use the term Android in your product name so long as you pass the CTS. And there's some further restrictions, so you can't use Android as the first part of the name, but you can have something on Android. Android can be somewhere further down the name. Okay, so CTS not only gives you compatibility, it also gives you some ability to use the Android term. So this is great. It means that we can take AOSP and we can modify it and ship it in lots of different ways. So now we look at the not so good bits, and we look at the closed source parts of Android. And to start off with, I want to focus on the board support package, or BSP. So AOSP does not give you a complete product. You're going to need some kind of board support unless you're just going to run on an emulator. So the board support package includes support for the particular chip you're using. There's a lot of peripherals within that chip. Each one of them requires some support within the board support package. Including things like there'll be hardware video codecs built into the chip. You'll need support for those video codecs in the various video libraries. Likewise, there'll be drivers for the voice or the radio interface layer, for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other wireless communication. And then there's additional things like authentication, fingerprint sensors, maybe the algorithms which do face recognition. A lot of this is built in using silicon within the chip. And then specific to automotive, you're not going to get very far unless you have a vehicle HAL. The VHAL is the thing which interfaces your operating system to the underlying vehicle and communicates with the vehicle signals. Unfortunately, most of this stuff is usually closed source. And it comes from a combination of places. So some of it will come from the SoC vendor. So we're talking Qualcomm or NXP or Rockchip or somebody like that. Plus whoever makes the board. So the head units are often not made by the OEM themselves, but made by some other manufacturer. And then, of course, the vehicle OEM themselves will have to do the final integration with the VHAL and with the screens and microphones and whatever. And then moving up the stack a little bit, AOSP only gives you the basic operating system. So on top of this, you're going to need some apps. You're going to need a launcher, browser, search, message, voice, etc. You're going to need an app store so you can access and install, or rather the user can access and install additional apps. You'll need an over-the-air update mechanism, which often is combined with the app store. So this can push both updates to the apps and also updates to the basic platform. And at least some of those things will require some back-end services. So the App Store obviously will, and the over-the-air updates, but also things like search and messaging and whatever. That all requires some kind of back-end support. So you need all of this to make a viable product. So where do you get this stuff from? Well, Google have solutions for many of these things in terms of GAS and also GMS for smartphones. Some of the stuff you're probably going to have to write in-house, particularly in the case of automotive, the apps that are going to interface directly with the car, the kind of pre-built apps that give you car information and allow you to turn the lights on and off and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be done pretty much in-house. And some of it could be open source, although in practice, open source doesn't feature that much at the app layer in this scenario. So let's talk a little bit about GAS and the issues this kind of creates. So if you're not familiar with GAS, GAS is essentially just GMS, but for automotive. So it does the same things that GMS does, but with some additional stuff automotive related. So typically when you license GAS from Google, you will license a package of applications, so Maps, the Assistant, Search, etc., etc. You'll license Play Store. Also things like backend services like cloud messaging, Google Sign-On, location provider, all kinds of useful stuff. And, oh yeah, more recently, Google are now marketing this as Google built-in. So Google built-in means GAS, basically. So we can put this all together. And here's my diagram showing which bits are open and which bits are closed. So at the bottom of the stack, of the software stack, we have Linux, which is overseeing the whole thing, of course. And then looking just at the open source bits, we have AOSP. And above that, we have the Android APIs that are supported directly within the AOSP. That is all open source stuff. All the rest is going to be closed source. So as you can see, there's a big blue layer here, which is the HAL layer, usually closed source. Over there at the top left, we have the OEM-specific stuff. So OEM apps, both system apps and regular apps, and the APIs that they implement. And much of this can be applied also to just regular phones. Samsung have a whole bunch of system apps and regular apps which they ship with their phone, for example. Generic third party, so these are apps written just using the generic Android APIs. And then over on the right-hand side, we have the GAS interfaces, or GMS for phones, and the applications that use those additional APIs. Yeah, so it's mostly closed source, if we're honest. What can we do about this? So there are various projects kicking around which aim to increase the open sourceness of your Android platform. Some in particular I mentioned DRM HW Composer. So HW Composer is the HAL that allows you to access the graphics and display stuff on a screen. So DRM HW Composer is pretty widely used, actually, and that gives you an open source access to just to displaying basic stuff on the screen. And associated with that, we have the Mesa 3D stack. So that gives you open source GPU drivers for various mobile GPUs. Okay, so this is all good news. These things aren't universal, but they are pretty common. And then there are various other generic HALs. One I mentioned here is Tiny HAL, which is a generic audio HAL. And no doubt there are many others which I haven't mentioned here. If anybody has something they would like to add to this list, ping me somehow or talk to me afterwards, because I'd like to expand this list to make it a little bit more comprehensive. So there are people working on making more generic, more open source stuff. OK, I want to come back a little bit to this gas, non-gas thing, because that has some implications, and I want to talk a little bit about the resolution to that in a moment or two. So when you license gas from Google, so I've heard, I've never actually done this myself. So first of all, the license will require you to go through a whole bunch of certifications. So I mentioned the CTS, the Compatibility Test Suite, a few slides back. When you license gas, there's a whole bunch of extra tests you have to go through. And these, instead of just being self-certified, these will have to be certified by either a third party, a 3PL so-called, or theoretically by Google themselves, but in practice it's going to be 3PL. So this adds quite a lot of overhead to what you have to do. You also have to commit to a certain update cycle, which is not a bad thing, but you do have to commit to it. And you have to promise not to make certain changes to the platform, so you can only modify it in certain limited ways. And usually you have to commit to shipping the various apps in the GAS, the gas suite, such as Maps and Assistant and whatever. So it kind of limits what you can do within your platform. So this has led to an interesting situation then, where a number of, in fact, a large number of vehicle OEMs have declined to license gas. So again, compare this to the smartphone market. The smartphone market has pretty much unified around GMS. Certainly in the West, everywhere apart from China and Southeast Asia, in any case, if you have a phone, it has GMS, and that's the end of the story, basically. The automotive market is a little bit more independent. Vehicles are much more diverse than phones, so there are good reasons why vehicle manufacturers don't want to be too constrained by the licensing requirements. So if you look around the exhibition hall, you'll see that we have booths from Harman. So Harman have their own app store called Ignite. Forvia have an app store called Appning. There are various solutions for mapping, for voice, and various other components. So essentially what happens is that these people who don't license gas, they're going to be putting together a collection of these apps from these various sources. This isn't really advancing my open source argument at all, because all of this stuff is just as closed as gas. But it does lead, as I say, to some fragmentation issues, which I'll come to in a moment or two. Oh yeah, let's start at the bottom there. Recently, Google have actually started unbundling some of the apps from gas. So you'll find that some of the non-gas people actually are running, for example, Google Navigation. So this is both a good thing and a bad thing. So it's great that vehicle OEMs have choice and can tailor Android to run on their platform in the best way possible. But it does have an effect on the app developers. And this has been a theme, I think, throughout this automotive track within this conference. So gas, at least, is a standard. if your vehicle runs gas, then it will, theoretically at least, be able to run any app that is written to that standard. Without gas, we have much more variation and therefore fragmentation. So this brings me on to, I just want to put in a plug, another plug for COVESA. So we did a session on this yesterday, and I think this is critical to the success of the automotive market. So I'm not ashamed to give another plug for these guys. So COVESA is a whole bunch of things. The part of it that I'm focusing on is the Automotive App Framework Standardization Expert Group. Okay, we should come up with a shorter name for this thing, but that's what it is. And currently they're working on a bunch of things. We talked about unified push yesterday, and I did a demo of that yesterday morning. We talked also yesterday, you have to go back to my presentation if you didn't see that. We talked about the app host and the issues with the open source app host actually falling behind the APIs implemented in the gas version of that. So there's some plans to unify that so that the app host, the support for the templated apps, is uniform across gas and non-gas implementations. There's a whole issue about accessing vehicle properties. This actually goes a little bit beyond what gas does. So one of the, there's a slight aside here, but it's interesting, I think. Android Automotive has a standardized set of vehicle properties, things like speed and also properties that allow you to adjust window, open and close windows and that kind of stuff. But a vehicle is much more complicated than is allowed for within that framework. So there is a standard called VSS, which allows you to more flexibly define properties and for applications to discover what those properties actually are and what they do. So this is in addition to what you get just with plain gas. And some stuff with video and so on and so forth. So COVESA are doing a whole bunch of things to do this stuff, and the crucial thing is all of this stuff is open source. All these standards are open, which is great. So if you're not already, it'd be great to see some of the people in this room and some of the people watching this video later on to come along to the COVESA meetings. You don't even have to actually be a member to attend the meetings. If you've got something useful to say, come along and say it. Okay, so pushing that aside a little bit then, I want to switch gear a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about open source in a more general way. So making the best of open source community. So this applies not only to what we're talking about here, but also open source in general. So I want to say here then, two separate things really. First of all, open source is a two-way street. It's not just free code. So as well as being able to download the code and look at it, you can upstream patches or modifications. Beyond that, you can talk to people. Usually in each open source project has some kind of forum where you can talk to the developers, you can influence development, you can talk to other people using that project. So you can share experiences, you can ask questions. It makes the whole thing much more collaborative, and it eases the process of developing your products. So open source is a two-way street. The other thing I want to say is that taking advantage of this is a win-win case. So some people have a little bit of a fear about open source. They think it's giving things away. It really isn't. it is sharing. It's sharing the load. So it's a win-win situation in 3 different cases. First of all, it's a win for the individual developer. When you contribute upstream, you get kudos for that. People will recognize that. It's something you can put on your CV. It will help you get your next job, maybe. Also, it just makes you feel good. Well, it makes me feel good, at least. So for the individual, yeah, it's a great thing to do. What about the team? Well, it's a win for the team as well. If you have, within your team, people contributing upstream and communicating with other developers, even other developers in other companies, it's still a good thing. It means problems get resolved faster, changes merged upstream, reduce your maintenance overhead, because it means you don't have to keep on reapplying those patches every time you get a new release. And yeah, you just get a faster turnaround and a better implementation of your project or concept or whatever. And finally, it's good for the company as a whole. So this is how you sell it to your management. Amongst other things, it means that you have a chance to influence the upstream project to get your ideas become the standard ideas, rather than having to take somebody else's ideas. You get the reduced maintenance, as I mentioned in the previous bullet point. And most important of all, it ends up with happier, more efficient teams, which is what your management ultimately, I hope, is wanting. So it's a win-win situation. You can sell this. And I say you can sell this because as a developer, you're going to have to push this upwards through your management structure. So you need to educate your management as to why open source works. Another kind of little side topic, but again, kind of interesting. Yeah, how come Android is open source? How did that ever happen? So this was a decision, really, with the Android development team way back in 2007, 2008, when they released Android. And it was, at that point, a mechanism to get maximum traction with the, at that time, the handset developers. They could go along to the handset developers and say, hey, here is a mobile operating system, works off the shelf, here's the source code to it, you go and adapt it, and the open source license guarantees that you will always have access to this code, so you're not locked in that way. Although they did then lock them in later on with GMS, but that's a different story. So essentially, from Google's point of view, AOSP being open source was a marketing ploy. It meant that they got initial traction within the market. One consequence of this is the way that AOSP is, or Android is, monetized. So Google don't actually make any money from Android itself. Android essentially is provided for free, or at least for very little money, to the various OEMs. Android makes money from Android being a funnel to funnel users of Android to its services. So Android itself has never been a profit center. It is, yeah, it's just a mechanism to direct people to and make people use Android services. And it's kind of remained that way. So this brings me into the concept of community again. So community was never part of the plan. In fact, Andy Rubin, who is the guy who created Android Inc. way back in 2003 or something, and then sold that to Google. At Google I/O 2011, he said, more or less, open source is different from a community-driven project. when he says open source, he means AOSP in this case. We're light on community, meaning they don't really have any. But everything we do ends up in an open source repository. We make the code open source when the first device is ready. So that's kind of the model that the Android team has always followed, and they continue to follow. And if you follow that link there, there's a more in-depth coverage of that, but I think I have the essence of it. So this is why Android is open, but not really totally open. It's open in that the license says it's open, but there isn't an open source development model behind it. This has led to some suspicion of what Google's motives are, particularly going forwards. So I just want to, tackle this kind of head on. Particularly this year, in the last few months, Google has been doing some things that have worried people. So first of all, they ended the AOSP first philosophy. So when I say that, it says here, we make the code available when the first device is ready. About a year ago, a couple of years ago, there was a move towards an AOSP first development model. In other words, developing things on the main branch in the open. And that applied to the build system and a few other bits and pieces. So this is great. It meant we could actually see what's happening, and it was more like a normal open source project. Unfortunately, that has finished, and now everything is done behind closed doors. Next, with Android 16, they dropped support for the Pixel phone from AOSP. So devices / Google / various Pixel models has disappeared, which is a pity. More recently, security patches used to be every month. They're now every quarter. And there is this ongoing question as to whether the latest code drop for Android 16 QPR1, it's a little bit late. Normally it's within like 2 or 3 days of the code release, which I think was the 3rd of September. Yeah, it's still not quite doing anything. So there's a bunch of things there which kind of make people say, what are Google doing here? Well, I don't know. But my opinion is Google retreating from open source? I don't think so. I think that they are so entrenched, and the whole open source model, not only with the developers like myself and other people using AOSP, but also just the way that Google works commercially, it's based around the open source model. They can't really change that, I don't think. So, yeah. Google is, in my opinion, not retreating from open source, but it is taking it slightly less seriously than it was maybe 12 months ago. OK, last couple of slides. What can you do about it? Well, I kind of mentioned a few things already. The main thing is take open source seriously within both personal projects and corporate projects. I mentioned a few slides back, ways of kind of selling open source to your management if you have an issue there. It is good for everybody, trust me. Mentioned particularly the issue of maintaining your own patch set and having to reapply those patches every time you get a release. That's a crazy thing to do. And then, looping back to this community thing, if we come back to here, Andy Rubin said, we don't do community, which is a pity. So we've been doing a few things to try and improve this recently. So about a year ago, myself and a bunch of others created a thing called AOSP Devs. And this is, yeah, it's a community of AOSP developers. There's a Discord server with lots of conversations going on there. There's a website, aospdevs.org, with some useful content. by the way, if anybody wants to help me improve that content, please go ahead and do so. And we also do meetups, both in person, at FOSDEM, for example, and India FOSS last week, or maybe the week before. And we have the online meetups every 2 months, AOSP, and AAOS, github.io is the place to go for that. So we're trying to fill in the gaps that Google have left. Yes, I think I've said most of this stuff. Oh, we have a newsletter. Yeah, newsletter. Let me just quickly say why that's important. The thing is that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the chat groups on the Discord server, but it kind of scrolls up out of the way. So one of the functions of the newsletter is to record some of the more interesting conversations and give pointers there. So if you want to see what people have been talking about, it's maybe a good idea to go look through the newsletters first. We have blogs. We have a thing called a library, which is a reference of useful resources around. And the whole thing is in GitHub. So if you want to contribute, you can just create a pull request, and one of us will take it on board. Meetup, I kind of mentioned this already. Over 1,000 members. A couple of days ago, we crossed the 1,000 threshold. I think there's actually 1,003 when I checked this morning. So that's pretty good. In my opinion, that's quite a big number. And I think pretty much on time, hopefully. That's pretty much everything I want to say. We have a couple of minutes free if anybody has a question. Otherwise, you can always catch me in the hallway later on.